Joe DiMaggio gave away his entire baseball salary to war widows. He donated every penny in secret and told no one for 20 years. When America finally discovered what Joe had done, the entire nation broke down crying. Why did the greatest baseball player in history choose to live in poverty to help strangers? December 7th, 1943. New York City. Joe DiMaggio secretly delivered his entire baseball salary to war widows' families, leaving envelopes of cash on their doorsteps in the middle of the night. He never revealed who he was. What Joe did that winter would remain America's most beautiful secret for 2 decades. This is the story of Joe DiMaggio's greatest act of kindness, and how a baseball hero became an American legend, not for what he did on the field, but for what he did in the shadows. Joe DiMaggio had just finished the 1943 baseball season with the New York Yankees. It had been a good year for Joe, but a terrible year for America. World War II was raging across Europe and the Pacific. Every day American families received devastating news that their sons, fathers, and husbands had been killed in battle. Joe was 28 years old, and at the peak of his career, he was earning $75,000 a year, which was more money than most families would see in a lifetime. But Joe couldn't enjoy his success while so many families were suffering. Joe had grown up poor in San Francisco. His father was a fisherman who worked long hours just to put food on the table. Joe remembered what it was like to go to bed hungry. Now Joe was rich and famous, but he hadn't forgotten where he came from. As Joe walked through New York City that winter, he saw families struggling everywhere he looked. Many women had lost their husbands in the war and were trying to raise children alone. These war widows had no income and no way to support themselves. The government provided some assistance to war widows, but it wasn't enough to cover basic needs like food, rent, and heating. Joe would see women standing in line at soup kitchens, holding their children's hands. He would see families being evicted from their apartments because they couldn't pay rent. These sights broke Joe's heart. Joe started carrying cash in his pockets so he could help people when he saw them in need. If he saw a woman struggling to buy groceries, he would pay for her food. If he saw a family that looked hungry, he would give them money for a meal. But Joe realized that his small acts of kindness weren't enough. The problem was too big for random donations. Joe decided he needed to do something bigger. On December 7th, 1943, exactly 2 years after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Joe made a decision that would change dozens of lives. Joe contacted the New York City War Relief Office and asked for a list of war widows in the city. "I want to help these families," Joe told the office worker. "That's very kind of you, Mr. DiMaggio," the worker replied. "Any donation would be appreciated." "I don't want to make a small donation," Joe said. "I want to make a big difference." The worker gave Joe a list of 50 families who had lost fathers in the war. These families were struggling the most and needed immediate help. Joe studied the list carefully. Each family had a story that broke his heart. There was Mary O'Sullivan, a 25-year-old mother of 3 whose husband had died at D-Day. She was working 2 jobs but still couldn't pay rent. There was Rosa Martinez, a 30-year-old woman whose husband had died in the Pacific. She was pregnant with their second child and had no money for medical care. There was Eleanor Washington, a 35-year-old mother of 5 whose husband had died in Italy. She was facing eviction and had nowhere to take her children. Joe read every story and felt his heart breaking. These women were heroes too, but they were fighting a different kind of war, a war for survival. That night, Joe made the most important decision of his life. Joe went to his bank and withdrew his entire baseball salary for 1943, all $75,000 of it. Joe's banker was shocked. "Mr. DiMaggio, what do you need this much cash for?" the banker asked. "I'm going to help some people," Joe replied. "But this is your entire year's salary," the banker said. "How will you live?" "I'll figure it out," Joe said. Joe divided the $75,000 into 50 envelopes, putting $1,500 in each one. In 1943, $1,500 was enough to cover a family's expenses for several months. Joe wrote a simple note that he put in each envelope. "For your family, with respect and gratitude for your husband's sacrifice, from someone who cares." Joe didn't sign the notes. He didn't want the families to know who their benefactor was. Starting that night, Joe began his secret mission. Every evening after dark, Joe would put on his warmest coat and walk through the streets of New York. He would carry several envelopes in his pockets and visit the homes on his list. Joe would wait until he was sure no one was watching. Then he would quietly place an envelope on a family's doorstep, knock on the door, and disappear into the shadows before anyone could see him. Joe's first delivery was to Mary O'Sullivan's apartment in Brooklyn. Mary was a young Irish woman who lived in a tiny apartment with her 3 children. Her husband Patrick had died at Normandy 6 months earlier. Mary was working as a seamstress during the day and cleaning offices at night. She was exhausted and barely making enough money to feed her children. When Mary heard the knock on her door that cold December evening, she was scared. Late-night knocks usually meant bad news. Mary opened her door and found no one there, but she did find an envelope on her doorstep. Mary opened the envelope and couldn't believe her eyes. Inside was more money than she had ever seen at one time, along with a note expressing gratitude for her husband's sacrifice. Mary started crying. She called her children to show them what had happened. "Mama, where did this come from?" her oldest son asked. "I don't know," Mary said, "but it came from someone with a very good heart." Mary used the money to pay her rent for the next 4 months, buy warm clothes for her children, and put food on the table every night. For the first time since Patrick's death, Mary felt hope. Joe continued his secret deliveries every night for 2 weeks. Each delivery filled Joe with a sense of purpose he had never experienced on a baseball field. Joe delivered money to Rosa Martinez, who used it to pay for her pregnancy care and prepare for her new baby. He delivered money to Eleanor Washington, who was able to keep her apartment and buy Christmas presents for her 5 children. Joe visited families in Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx. He walked miles through the snow and cold, but he never complained. Some nights, Joe would accidentally wake up children when he knocked on doors. He would hide in doorways and listen to families discover the money. Joe heard children cheering when they realized their mother could buy food for Christmas dinner. Joe heard women crying tears of relief when they realized they could pay their rent and wouldn't be evicted. Joe heard prayers being said, thanking God for sending help when they needed it most. These sounds filled Joe's heart with more joy than any baseball game ever had. By Christmas Eve 1943, Joe had delivered all 50 envelopes. He had given away his entire baseball salary and had only a few $100s left to his name. Joe's friends and teammates noticed that he wasn't spending money like he used to. Joe had always been generous with restaurant meals and expensive clothes, but suddenly he was living very simply. "Joe, are you having money problems?" asked his teammate Phil Rizzuto. "No, I'm fine," Joe replied. "I just don't need much to be happy." Joe's teammates didn't know that Joe was eating simple meals at home instead of expensive restaurants. They didn't know that Joe was wearing the same clothes for weeks instead of buying new ones. Joe was living like a regular working person, not a famous baseball star. But Joe had never been happier. Joe's secret act of kindness had an immediate impact on the families he helped. Mary O'Sullivan was able to keep her family together and eventually found a better job. Her children grew up healthy and successful. Rosa Martinez gave birth to a healthy daughter and was able to stay home with her children during their early years. Eleanor Washington kept her apartment, and all 5 of her children graduated from high school. But Joe's generosity had an even bigger impact than he realized. The families Joe helped began helping other families in their neighborhoods. Mary O'Sullivan started a food program at her church. Rosa Martinez organized clothing drives for military families. Eleanor Washington began tutoring children whose fathers were away at war. Joe's kindness had created a ripple effect of generosity throughout New York City. But Joe knew nothing about this impact because he had moved on with his life and never looked back. Joe returned to baseball in 1944 and had another successful season. He earned a good salary again, but he never forgot the lesson he had learned during the winter of 1943. Joe continued to help people quietly throughout his career, but he never again gave away his entire salary. Joe's secret remained safe for 20 years. In 1963, a reporter named Jimmy Cannon was working on a story about war relief efforts during World War II. Cannon was interviewing Mary O'Sullivan, who was now a successful businesswoman and community leader. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, you've done so much to help military families over the years," Cannon said. "What inspired you to start this work?" Mary told Cannon about the mysterious envelope she had received 20 years earlier. "Someone gave my family $1,500 when we desperately needed it," Mary said. "I never found out who it was, but that act of kindness changed my life." Cannon was intrigued by Mary's story. He decided to investigate who might have been her anonymous benefactor. Cannon contacted other war widows from the same time period and discovered that dozens of families had received identical envelopes with identical notes. Cannon realized that someone had organized a massive relief effort in 1943, but had kept it completely secret. Cannon spent weeks investigating. He checked bank records, interviewed relief workers, and talked to anyone who might have information. Finally, Cannon got a break. A former bank employee remembered Joe DiMaggio withdrawing $75,000 in cash in December 1943. "I thought it was strange that he wanted so much cash," the former employee told Cannon. "But Mr. DiMaggio said he was going to help some people." Cannon put the pieces together and realized that Joe DiMaggio had been the anonymous benefactor. Cannon contacted Joe to ask him about the story. "Mr. DiMaggio, I'm investigating war relief efforts from 1943, Cannon said. "Did you provide assistance to war widows that winter?" Joe was quiet for a long moment. He had hoped his secret would never be discovered. "Yes," Joe said finally. "I helped some families." "Can you tell me about it?" Cannon asked. "I'd prefer not to," Joe replied. "Those families needed help, and I was able to provide it. That's all there is to say." But Cannon was persistent. He had already confirmed most of the story and wanted Joe to provide the details. Eventually, Joe agreed to tell Cannon the full story, but only if Cannon promised to focus on the families Joe helped rather than on Joe himself. Cannon's article was published in the New York Times in January 1964. The headline read, "DiMaggio's secret baseball star gave entire salary to war widows." The story revealed how Joe had given away $75,000 to help 50 families during the winter of 1943. The reaction to Cannon's article was immediate and overwhelming. Newspapers across the country picked up the story. Radio stations discussed Joe's generosity on their programs. Television news shows featured interviews with the families Joe had helped. Americans were amazed that their baseball hero had performed such a selfless act and had kept it secret for 20 years. Letters poured in to Joe from all over the country. People praised his generosity and said he had restored their faith in humanity. Mary O'Sullivan, who was now 45 years old, finally learned the identity of her anonymous benefactor. "Joe DiMaggio saved my family," Mary told reporters. "I always wondered who had helped us. Now I know it was a true American hero." Other families Joe had helped came forward to share their stories. They described how Joe's generosity had changed their lives and allowed them to rebuild after losing their husbands and fathers. But not everyone was happy about the story becoming public. Joe was embarrassed by all the attention. He had never wanted recognition for his act of kindness. "I didn't do it for publicity," Joe told reporters. "I did it because those families needed help, and I was in a position to help them." Joe's teammates from 1943 were shocked to learn about Joe's secret. "Joe never said a word about giving away his salary," said Phil Rizzuto. "He just quietly lived on almost nothing and never complained." "Now I understand why Joe was so careful with money that winter," said another teammate. "He had given it all away to people who needed it more than he did." The story of Joe's generosity spread around the world. Newspapers in Europe and Asia wrote about the American baseball player who had sacrificed his wealth to help war widows. Joe's act of kindness had become a symbol of American generosity and compassion. President Lyndon Johnson invited Joe to the White House to honor him for his service to military families. "Joe DiMaggio represents the best of America," President Johnson said. "He showed that true heroism isn't just about athletic achievement, but about using your success to help others." Joe was honored by the invitation, but he remained uncomfortable with the attention. "I just did what anyone would do," Joe told the president. "Those families had sacrificed everything for our country. The least I could do was help them when they needed it." The impact of Jimmy Cannon's article continued to grow throughout 1964. Baseball teams across the country started programs to help military families. Players began donating portions of their salaries to veteran support organizations. Joe's example had inspired a new culture of giving in professional sports. But the most meaningful response to the article came from the families Joe had helped 20 years earlier. These families organized a surprise celebration for Joe at Yankee Stadium. On a warm evening in July 1964, Mary O'Sullivan and 30 other families that Joe had helped gathered at the stadium to thank him publicly. When Joe was introduced to the crowd, he was shocked to see the families he had helped standing on the field. Mary O'Sullivan spoke for the group. "Mr. DiMaggio, 20 years ago you saved our families," Mary said. "You gave us hope when we had none. You showed us kindness when we needed it most. We wanted to come here tonight to say thank you." Joe was moved to tears. He had never expected to see these families again, and he certainly hadn't expected them to remember his help after so many years. "You don't need to thank me," Joe said. "You were the brave ones. You were the ones who kept your families together after losing your husbands. You were the real heroes." The crowd at Yankee Stadium gave Joe a standing ovation that lasted for 5 minutes, but Joe wasn't thinking about the applause. He was thinking about the children he had helped, who were now adults with families of their own. Joe realized that his $75,000 donation had grown into something much larger. The children he had helped had grown up to be teachers, doctors, business owners, and community leaders. His investment in those 50 families had created value that far exceeded any financial return. But there's more to this story that shows how deeply Joe's kindness affected the people he helped. In 1965, Mary O'Sullivan received a letter from Robert Martinez. He was Rosa Martinez's son, the baby Rosa had been carrying when Joe helped her family in 1943. Robert was now 22 years old and had just graduated from college. He was the first person in his family to receive a higher education. "Mrs. O'Sullivan," Robert wrote, "Mr. DiMaggio helped my family too, and his kindness changed my entire life." Robert explained that his mother Rosa had used Joe's money to pay for medical care during her pregnancy. That care had saved both Rosa's life and Robert's life when complications developed during birth. "Without Mr. DiMaggio's help, my mother and I both would have died," Robert wrote. "Instead, I grew up healthy and was able to get an education. I'm now a doctor." Mary realized that Joe's kindness had continued to create positive effects more than 20 years later. Mary decided to organize a reunion of all the families Joe had helped. Mary spent months tracking down the 50 families from Joe's list. What she discovered was extraordinary. Of the children who had been helped by Joe's generosity, 47 had graduated from high school, 23 had graduated from college, 12 had become teachers, 8 had become doctors or nurses. Mary compiled this information and sent it to Joe. Joe was overwhelmed when he read Mary's report. He had never imagined that his $75,000 donation could have such a lasting impact. The reunion was held at a church in Brooklyn on a Sunday afternoon in 1965. When Joe walked into the church hall, he was greeted by more than 200 people, the original families plus their children and grandchildren. One by one, people stood up to tell Joe their stories. Robert Martinez spoke about how Joe's help had saved his life and enabled him to save other lives as a doctor. Patricia Washington spoke about how Joe's kindness had enabled her to stay in school and become a teacher. Michael O'Sullivan spoke about how Joe's help had given his family stability. He had grown up to become a police officer. The most moving moment came when a young girl named Sarah Martinez, Robert's daughter, approached Joe. Sarah was 8 years old and had prepared a thank you card for Joe. "Mr. DiMaggio," Sarah said, "my daddy told me that you helped my grandma before I was born. I wanted to thank you because if you hadn't helped her, my daddy wouldn't be here and I wouldn't be here either." Joe knelt down to Sarah's level and looked into her eyes. "Sarah," Joe said, "you and your family helped me more than I ever helped you. You taught me what it means to make a difference in the world." Joe was moved to tears by Sarah's simple words. After the reunion, Joe continued to stay in touch with many of the families he had helped. Joe attended graduations, weddings, and other important family celebrations. He became like an adopted grandfather to dozens of children. When Mary O'Sullivan's grandson was born in 1970, she asked Joe to be the baby's godfather. Joe was honored to accept. When Robert Martinez opened his medical practice in 1972, Joe was the first person he called to share the good news. When Patricia Washington was named Teacher of the Year in 1975, she dedicated the award to Joe DiMaggio. These relationships continued throughout Joe's life. Joe's generosity had created an extended family that spanned multiple generations. In 1980, Mary O'Sullivan organized another reunion for Joe's 65th birthday. This time, more than 400 people attended. At this reunion, the families announced that they had started a scholarship fund in Joe's honor. "Mr. DiMaggio," Mary announced, "you started with $75,000 and 50 families. Now those families have contributed money to start a fund that will help hundreds more children get an education." Joe was amazed to learn that the families he had helped were now helping other families in turn. The scholarship fund eventually grew to more than $1 million and helped more than 500 children attend college. When Joe died in 1999, his funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by his kindness. Mary O'Sullivan, who was now 81 years old, spoke at the funeral on behalf of all the families Joe had helped. "Joe DiMaggio showed us that one person can change the world. Mary said. He proved that the greatest victories happen not on baseball fields but in the quiet moments when we choose to help someone else. Mary concluded her speech with words that captured the true measure of Joe's legacy. Joe gave us $75,000 in 1943, but what he really gave us was hope. Hope that there are good people in the world. Hope that kindness still matters. Hope that one person's generosity can create ripple effects that last for generations. Today, more than 80 years after Joe's act of kindness, the effects of his generosity are still being felt. Joe DiMaggio's story reminds us that true greatness is not measured by fame or achievement, but by the positive impact we have on other people's lives. Joe's decision to give away his entire salary to help war widows proves that one person's kindness can create waves of goodness that last for generations. The winter of 1943 was indeed Joe DiMaggio's greatest season, not because of what he accomplished for himself, but because of what he made possible for others. If this story of selfless generosity and quiet heroism moved you, subscribe for more untold stories of how true character is revealed, not in moments of glory, but in moments of sacrifice. Like this video if you believe Joe's winter of giving was his greatest achievement, and comment below, what would you do if you could help 50 families in need? Next week we're revealing another story of how ordinary people become extraordinary heroes when they choose compassion over comfort. Remember, the greatest home runs aren't always hit on baseball fields. Sometimes they're hit in the hearts of people who need hope most.